Hi, everyone. This is Kara from the Centre Branch Library here for Comic Chat today, and I am here with my new co-host.
Hi, I'm Alexander. I'm from the River Park Branch Library, children's librarian over there.
Awesome. And today we are going to be talking to you about some graphic memoirs. So let me get my screen up here. All right. The first graphic memoir that we are going to talk about today is They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. And this is one that is good for teens. We usually put it in the library, but George Takei himself says that it's also great for adults and some children, just depending on what you are interested in reading. It's a real straightforward story about his experience living in the Japanese American internment camps. So the story opens with the scene of the Takei family being evicted from their homes by American soldiers, and they're sent to live in an internment camp. And this is right after, I think, that Pearl Harbor was bombed, so America was in a very tenuous position. The story opens, no, the narrative is mostly told through the eyes of George Takei as a young child. I think he's about 5 when this story starts. So he's not really totally aware of what's going on. So it kind of has this like innocent perspective. It focuses mostly on his escapades, but he also gives a little of his father's perspective from some talks that they ended up having later in life, and explains some of his father's internal struggles with this whole experience. And he also highlights his parents' marriage in here. There's a kind of like a sweetness to this. One other thing he talks about is some of like the difficult choices that the Japanese Americans had to make in regards to some decisions that were made during the course of World War II. And then also he talks a little bit about adjusting to life after the internment camp and coming to terms with the experiences as an adult, and includes some of those later talks that he had with his father. And of course, he does talk about when he was recruited for Star Trek, and he talks a little bit about that. So if you're a Star Trek fan, there's that in there for you too. It's a real good educational book. One of the points that he makes in here is that when he was in college, there weren't a lot of writings about this period for Japanese Americans, and the only source of information he had was his father, who didn't really want to talk about it. So one of the reasons he wrote this book was to get that information out there. All right, we're going to go to our next book.
The next book we're going to talk about is called Hey Kiddo. It's by Jarrett Krasashka, I believe. He's normally a very much like a second, third grade graphic novel artist, so it was kind of a curveball when he came out with this. It's a memoir about being raised by his grandparents because his mother in the early mid 80s, early 90s was a heroin addict. So it's really heavy subject matter. We categorize it in teen at the library. This is not one that I would suggest for maybe under 13s. His grandmother in particular, who raised him, is extremely vulgar, and he pulls no punches about her dialogue. You see her like cursing him out when he's like 7 or 8. But it's mostly, it covers like his kind of super young childhood up to high school graduation, dealing with the fact that he didn't even know his real last name until he was about 17. He finally met his father when he was 17. One of the main aspects of it as well is how the author kind of found his solace in art and drawing and cartooning. And even though it's a relatively modern memoir, like I think he's only maybe 5 years older than I am, the way that he talks about even in the 90s, people were still like, oh, cartooning's not serious art. You're never going to make a living doing this. You should just put it away and do still lives from now on. But he ends up even like not transferring high school so he can do the comic in the school newspaper. It ends up being like his only really outlet. But you do see he's got a good, dry, sarcastic sense of humor, and he gets through it all right. And in the epilogue, what I really like is he does mention he now has, strangely, a very good friendship with his father and has become extremely close to his two half siblings. So it does, in fact, I'm glad that he put the epilogue in there, because even though his mother does pass from an overdose, it does talk about like, over time, he completely came to terms with everything that happened, understands that addiction is absolutely a disease that needs to be treated, even though, I mean, when it hits you hard as a 15-year-old, you're not going to see, like if you haven't had your mother with you your whole life, he mentions, you're not going to see it with the same reasoning as somebody who's going through the programs and everything. But it's some really rough subject matter, especially, I think there are a lot of teens that will probably relate to it, but do not let the younger kids read this one unless you want to hear some very creative swearing afterwards. But yeah, I still really enjoyed it. And the art is excellent because he's coming from this very cartoony background. It creates this really weird perspective for it. Like his color palette is very muted, lots of black and white and a little bit of red. And that's essentially it. So, but still very like dreamlike, very not super hyper realistic as some comics. And I think that really lets him play around with the subject matter a bit.
And then you also told me, Alexander, that he writes for kids now, doesn't he?
Yeah, he did before too. That's why this was such a curveball when he released it, that like, he has a series called The Lunch Ladies. He's got Platypus Police Squad, like very goofy stuff, kind of in the Captain Underpants vein. So to have him then come through and write this extremely honest, harrowing memoir, especially as still a relatively young man, like it was a little shocking. It's almost like seeing Dave Pilkey write something like this, but it's really good, and I personally really appreciated his honesty with it.
Right. Awesome. That sounds like a good one. And I just want to mention to our viewers that although most of the comics we've been talking about are available on Hoopla, this one is available on Overdrive, which you can also, log in with your library card. The next one we're going to talk about here is March. This is another pretty heavy subject about John Lewis and his involvement with civil rights. So this is for adults and teens. I have read this with teens before, so it's not so graphic that it would be inappropriate for teens. And when I've read this with teens before, they've really been introspective about it, talking about these race issues in a way that maybe they hadn't thought of before.
This is one that I'm very glad to see is showing up on a lot of school curriculums.
Right. Yeah. It is a very important book, I think. So basically, the story opens with present-day Congressman John Lewis telling these two boys about his life growing up on a farm in the South. And he goes into also what it was like to go to school during desegregation. And they have a lot of questions for him. But it's kind of like a nostalgic, kind of whimsical storyline to begin with. Then his narrative continues to follow his involvement with the civil rights group when he's in college. It kind of starts, it really starts when he begins listening to Martin Luther King Jr. on the radio. And he's kind of inspired by him. So he tries to transfer to an all-white college with the help of Dr. King, but he's not able to do it. They have to file a lawsuit. And because of his age, I think they can't file the lawsuit without the support of his parents. So he ends up going back to his regular college in Nashville. But he does become involved with a passive resistance group there. They organize sit-ins, and he goes through basically like all the steps of this. So they had these meetings where they practiced, I guess, like harassing each other. So they practiced what they thought they would have to endure for a sit-in, and then they would go to these establishments and just say, like, sit down at a counter where they weren't allowed to sit, and see who would get them to leave, and then they would leave. And then eventually they started organizing actual sit-ins. And as he tells about this, he also parallels the narrative with the success and the progression of the success of sit-ins around the country. And that's where the first book ends, but there are two more after that. And it's a really, I think it's like a really honest look at this history, and an interesting perspective, because he also talks about the differences between his group of protesters and also the more traditional Black leadership, and how they kind of also had some resistance there again. So this is one I would highly recommend.
Yeah, it's one that I really appreciated, that it brought more perspectives and nuance to something that is often like a one, or at least when I was in high school, it was a 1 or 2 day unit in American history that really should be months and months. But if you get the more generalized view of the civil rights movement, you miss a lot of the little details that I really appreciate that the book brings in.
Right. And it's also kind of interesting to think about, John Lewis is still alive, and he like knew Martin Luther King personally. So I think we often think of Martin Luther King Jr. as sort of like this person, so far back in history. But to connect him that way, we realize it's more recent than sometimes we think about.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then we got one more comic to talk about, and this one is for kids specifically, but I encourage any grown-up to read it. A lot of these kids comics that are coming out are absolutely wonderful, wonderful reads. This one's called El Defo. It's by Cece Bell, and it's about around when she's 4 years old, she gets meningitis, and it doesn't give her like necessarily true deafness. It's almost like she doesn't actually define what she has, but she ends up having to learn how to read lips. She can sometimes hear, but can't understand. It's almost kind of like I think a processing disorder after that. But this is, I think it takes place in the mid 70s. So her first hearing aid still corded, and when she's in school, she has to wear this device, and the teacher wears a microphone that hangs off their neck, and she figures out that she can hear the teachers wherever they go. So she can hear them when they go to the bathroom and complain about other students. And later on in the book, she uses it to be a lookout, so that when the teacher makes them do quiet math and leaves the room to go have a cigarette, they party, and she can then let everyone know the teacher's on their way back. But the title also comes from when she really hates being singled out as being special. She just wants to feel absolutely normal. So when she needs to be brave and put people in their place, in her head, she becomes El Defo. But like most of us, that doesn't actually happen in real life. You just stay quiet and kind of, oh, okay, and just kind of take it. But it's a much, even though the subject matter seems like it'd be pretty heavy, she has such a good sense of humor about it. And it really is also just about, making friends and standing up for yourself. The first time you realize somebody's not a good friend, and liking a boy who's super nice to you. And it's a really cute story. And one thing she does to kind of lighten the tone is everyone in it is drawn as a rabbit. So it makes it slightly more abstract for some kids that may have trouble relating. And it does lighten the mood a little. No foul language in this one, so the kids aren't going to learn any creative swears. But yeah, I really, really liked it. And there's some fun little jokes in it too.
This is one of my favorite ones. When I was a school librarian, I had some hearing impaired students. So the first time I read this, I just, really what was amazed by how true to their experiences this seemed.
And one thing that I appreciate is it really does point out a few things that I know at least a few hard of hearing friends of mine would like everyone to know, like don't obscure your mouth when you're talking, look directly at people, don't shout, don't mumble. Once you're in the dark, all things are off. So all the different things that can kind of obscure people that are trying to read your lips. It gives a little primer at the beginning almost for it. And I also like how she resented her mom wanting her to learn sign language. Because again, she's like, I can talk. That's fine. I know how to talk.
Oh yeah. That's a super important issue too, because there are these two communities of like the deaf community who they only want, their students to learn sign language, and then you also have another community where they don't want their students to learn sign language because they want them to be able to communicate with everybody else. So really good nuances there. I kind of wish that this could be required reading in some schools, because I think it would just really help kind of like bridge the gap.
You thankfully you do see a lot of kids that have already read it. It comes up a lot whenever I talk to kids that have read all the Raina Telgemeier's, all the Victoria Jamiesons, and if they need another book, I often see, if I'm like, oh, have you read El Defo? Almost all of them are like, oh yeah. So
Awesome.
it is being read, but grown-ups read it too.
Awesome. And it's just a fun book.
It really is.
All right. That's all the books we have to talk about today. Join us next time. I think we're going to be talking about music and graphic novels. So we're really excited about that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you guys for watching.